of people within the trade union movement. In the U.S., they were represented by Samuel Gompers, who eventually founded the AFL-CIO, and their concept was what they called pure and simple trade unionism. And they said, no politics in the union, right? We're not here to talk about politics. We're not here to do anything like that. Our only goal is we're only the union. You know, again, it's Eduard Bernstein's the movement is everything, the aim is nothing. And Samuel Gompers was the leader of that in the U.S. And their concept was that you know, trade unions should have no other goals. And a lot of times these trade unions were only what they called guilds. They were the guilds, meaning that they only did a certain skilled trade, right? There would be the masons, they were the stone layers guild, the iron workers guild, and these were separate guilds, and they wouldn't even let what they called non-skilled workers join these unions. The idea that, you know, that a worker who, you know, just mops the floor and hasn't spent years as an apprentice could be in the same union as, you know, a skilled, highly educated worker. That was an insult. And there was all kinds of struggle. Do you want to?
Well, they had other functions too. One was an apprenticeship function to actually to develop people in the craft. But then an equally important function was to serve as a gatekeeper and keep people out. And a lot of the racism that you find in the American union movement is due to this gatekeeper function.
You know, keep people out and keep it, you know, only among the few.
But historically, because of this gatekeeper function, that's why racism had the sway that it did in periods in the trade union movement.
Yeah, well, I know it even goes in today. I know.
And in fact, the sentiment ran so strong, if I may, that among folks of my father's generation, they didn't want to have anyone make the mistake of calling them a trade union movement. They were a labor union movement, whereas they don't have that distinction, for instance, in England.
Wow. Well, I know even this is another example of what you're talking about. There is in 1966 or 68, there was the World's Fair in New York City. What year was that? Does anyone know? Okay, well, it was some point in the 60s, and the Construction Workers Union had a policy they would not allow people of color to join the union, and so the Construction Workers Union was, you know, prevented any people of color from helping construct the World's Fair, and so a group called CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, was calling for a boycott of the World's Fair. And I know Workers' World Party and a number of other socialist groups, I think the Socialist Workers' Party, you know, the Communist Party and other groups, were involved in actually, when people were getting on the trains to go to the World's Fair, they held the doors open to keep the trains from getting into the World's Fair, because the train can't move unless the doors close. And then so the police came down and there was a fight in New York City because people were calling for the, you know, the boycott of the World's Fair, because this guild, this union for skilled workers only, would not allow people of color to join, and so therefore all kinds of people of color were blocked from getting employment in the World's Fair. One of the largest socialist groups to form in the U.S. at this time was the Socialist Labor Party. And it began, and it was a coalition of a lot of different groups. And actually some of their books are on the shelf here. I know they have some old Socialist Labor Party books here. And there were a lot of different factions, and they were trade unions, trade unionists, socialists, intellectuals, and it was a general gathering. I believe they dissolved about 2 years ago, officially. But until then, they were the oldest third party in the U.S. that still exists. They were the Socialist Labor Party.
They're still around.
Yeah, well, their newspaper hasn't come out in at least 2 years. Their office, you know, the phone doesn't work. I don't know. There might be a couple of them. There might be a couple of them around. There was a guy in Cleveland for many years that I met. His name was, and he was a transit worker, and he was retired. And he would give me, their newspaper was The People. Right?
He'd always be up at Hessler Street.
Yeah. But the Socialist Labor Party was formed, and it was big in New York City. And one of the campaigns they were involved in was there was a candidate who was a religious figure. His name was Henry George, and Henry George's platform was that all land should be publicly owned, but not the industries, not the railroads, nothing else, just land. Land should be publicly owned, and that it should be done through a progressive income tax. And eventually, as people die and all that, we should generally take up all the land. And once we own the resources, then everything else will fall in line. And it was, kind of an anti-Marxist, kind of utopian socialist concept.
And this was when?
We're talking 1890s. And Henry George, but he was a really popular figure because he was kind of the symbol of the trade union movement, and he was really the only.
Well, it's important to point out, until into the 1950s, America was primarily an agrarian society. So.
Yeah, I mean the idea.
This kind of land reform has some basis in reality.
That makes sense. Yeah. And so Henry George, he was a popular figure. He wasn't a socialist, he wasn't a Marxist, and he was a Christian minister. But he was the symbol of the trade union movement, and of the farmers' movement. There was the Grange movement and the progressive movement. The farmer labor parties were forming. Well, they got to be a lot bigger later, but there was all these movements for farmers' rights that were forming at the time, and he was kind of the symbol of that. And he ran for mayor of New York City, and the Socialist Labor Party endorsed and staffed his campaign, not because he was a socialist, not because electing him would lead to socialism, but because he was the center of working class resistance. And they were following the same kind of concept that Lenin talked about how when there's a spark, you try to turn it into a conflagration. Henry George, really, a lot of people say that he actually won that election. It was very close, but he lost, and that was at the time when there was a lot of voter fraud going on. There's Tammany Hall in New York City and the Mafia, and it was a very popular campaign, and ultimately he did lose. Now, into the late 1890s, however, the Socialist Labor Party began to be kind of taken over by an intellectual figure named Daniel de Leon. He was a Jewish professor at, I believe it was New York University or one of these prominent colleges, and he was a brilliant orator, Daniel de Leon was. And he could give speeches, and rile up the crowds, and he could explain the concept of Marxism very clearly. But Daniel de Leon, he was not part of the working class. His group of followers were all kind of intellectuals and people who, sat around and discussed late into the night, like we're doing here, except the future utopian society. And Daniel de Leon coined, in response to the right-wing elements who were calling themselves possibilists, Daniel de Leon, he coined his term for his theory was called the impossibilists. He said that any reform under capitalism just hurts the problem, right? If you get higher wages, if you go on strike and you win higher wages, that just reinforces in people's minds that you don't need a revolution. That just makes them think, oh, all we need is to go on strike and get higher wages. So they refused to join any unions. They refused to participate in any demonstrations or anything. Their concept was, we're only for socialist revolution. And their activities consisted simply of agitating for socialist revolution, going around and bringing the true light of socialism to everyone they could reach. They did form trade unions, but their trade unions were not unions that actually did anything. They were what you call dual unions, meaning there would be a union at your shop, and then you're in another union, and they wouldn't join that union. Their unions they formed was I believe it was the National Council of Industrial Unions. Was that the name of it, Jay? Yeah, and it was all they did was they just agitated about the need for the industries to be seized by the workers, and ultimately, all the elements that wanted to stay involved in the class struggle were eventually expelled from the Socialist Party, or the Socialist Labor Party. And at this time, also, there was mass strikes going on in the U.S. There was the railroad workers all around the U.S. were on strike in huge numbers. One of the leader of the Railroad Workers Union was Eugene V. Debs. And while he was in prison for leading the strike, which was illegal, that's when someone was nice enough to bring him a copy of Karl Marx's Capital, which is a big book, but if you have nothing to do with sitting in your cell, you can...
It's 3 big books.
3 books, yeah, you can sit there and you can read it. And while in prison, Eugene V. Debs became a socialist, and he joined de Leon's Socialist Labor Party, but then, he actually wanted to be involved in the struggle, so he left and eventually formed what became the Socialist Party of the United States of America. So, within the Second International, you had Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg representing the left wing, you had the Bernsteinites and the Social Democratic Party of Germany representing the right wing. And the big fight that actually eventually destroyed the Second International was about World War I. As it looked like World War I was coming, the Second International, they had an international meeting where they determined that if the war happened, they would not be loyal to their homelands. Instead, they would be united, and they would be workers of the world unite, and they would not have loyalty. But pretty soon, most of the socialist parties, when the war broke out in 1917, or in 1914 is when it broke out. The U.S. didn't enter until 1917. Most of the parties around the world, excepting, of course, the Bolsheviks, the Italian party, I believe, also, and of course, our U.S. Socialist Party. That's why it became illegal. You know, they all had abandoned that and blindly supported the war.